Hello, everybody. Welcome back to OrbitCon. Thanks for joining us. If you want to ask a question during this panel or follow along and find other content as we go, you can go to the-orbit.net. We have a banner ad for OrbitCon at the top of basically every page. That'll take you to the schedule. On the schedule, you can click on the link for any session that you're interested in. Sessions that haven't already happened yet, you can ask questions in the comments. Sessions that have happened, you can watch at your leisure. And this session is on changing marriage officiant law. I'm Stephanie Zvan. I am actually working on this issue in Minnesota currently, working with Nick and CFI, also working with Minnesota Atheists, who's been working on the problem off and on for several years now. Nick, I would love it if you would introduce yourself and tell us a little overview of what it is that we're even talking about here.
Yeah, I'm Nick Little. I'm the legal director of the Center for Inquiry, based out of Washington, D.C. Secular celebrants is an issue that the Center for Inquiry has taken an important role in and looking out. It's an issue I actually very much enjoy working on because I kind of divide a lot of the church-state issues into the core church-state establishment clause issues into two separate sections. There's the section that we do see a lot of, that's a high school is having a prayer before its football games, or a courthouse has the Ten Commandments displayed on the wall, where we as the secular movement and the legal side of the secular movement are going in there saying, you can't do this. This is unconstitutional. This isn't allowed. This is a violation of the Establishment Clause. Stop doing it. So that's the one section. And the other section is which I put the secular celebrants laws in, is more of the give us a seat at the table type things. It's like something is happening under government regulation. Here it's the solemnization of marriages. You are unfairly restricting this only to religious people. Let us take a seat at the table. Let us sit down. Let us, as the secular community, also do this ourselves. And one of the reasons I particularly like that is not that it's more constitutionally valid or less constitutionally valid, but the reason I particularly like it is it's not taking anything away from anybody else. It's saying, if you want a priest to marry you, great. If you want your imam to marry you, great. Your rabbi, fantastic. How about our people, and let our people have the person they want do their marriage? Because legally speaking, anyone can perform a marriage ceremony. You can put a tuxedo on your dog and have him bark, whatever, but you only become legally married once your wedding certificate is solemnized. And each state, all 50 states and DC, have their own laws on who is allowed to sign that piece of paper, sign that marriage certificate to solemnize it. The one thing that almost every state has in common is that there are two groups that everywhere allows to do this. On the one hand, religious ministers, called different things in various states, ministers of the gospel. Basically, religious officiants can do this. And then judges, justices of the peace, magistrates can do it. So your secular option tends to be across the country going to a legal official you've never met who will do the service in whatever way he or she wants to do the service. What we're asking for in the Secular Celebrants campaign is let the people we at CFI train to be secular celebrants, let secular celebrants sign that piece of paper and marry people. Already across the country, anybody can go on their computer, it's the Universal Life Church, I believe. It's officially a church, and you can become an ordained minister of the Universal Life Church in probably 40 seconds flat and the payment of $10 or $15. Every state allows you then to perform marriages. And so it's kind of utterly ridiculous that people who are not willing to let's be honest, lie, not willing to claim they are religious ministers when they're not, that they can't perform services, they can't perform marriages, and yet you can get an online ordination and perform a marriage. It's religious privilege, and we're simply trying to remove that privilege state by state without taking away the rights of anyone who can currently solemnize marriages. And honestly, I've never found a religious person, when I explain this to them, I've never found a religious person who thinks it's wrong. In fact, they're all just amazingly surprised that we can't already do this.
Sorry, microphone didn't want to come back on. And so that's the general issue. Can you explain then a little bit of the legal basis on which we are fighting to get the same rights, basically? Because this is, I think, a little bit more involved than most people understand.
Right. It's the case that we're bringing, and to give people a bit of a background, we first brought this case in Indiana, where Reba, who heads up CFI Indiana and also heads up our secular Celebrant program, she was based out of there. And so we brought a lawsuit in federal court in Indiana, claiming we were represented by the ACLU the first time around. And our claim was that this violates the Establishment Clause because it's granting religious, under color of state law, it's putting religious belief in a position over and above the non-religious. And we also claim that there's an equal protection violation, that benefits of government, in this case, the right to choose who you want to perform your wedding ceremony, and the right to do wedding ceremonies itself was restricted based on an unconstitutional grounds and without any kind of justification given. It was just simply, if you're religious, you can do this. If you're non-religious, you can't. So there's an equal protection thing on that as well. So, government is allowed to discriminate in some situations, but the more important the right concerned, and here, religious freedom, the Establishment Clauses are fundamental rights, but they have to provide a certain level of justification for it. Given that you can go online, as I said, and become ordained in 10 minutes flat and do ceremonies everywhere you want, there's no justification whatsoever a state can give for excluding trained secular celebrants from doing this. So on the one hand, there's the Establishment Clause argument. On the other hand, there's the equal protection argument. We initially in Indiana lost the case. We lost it in the district court. And I tell you, every time I read that opinion, it amazes me more because it's just an appalling opinion. It's basically that, the state's allowed to do this because they're allowed to limit who does marriages. And we're like, yeah, you're right. They are allowed to do that, but they have to do it in a constitutional way. We appealed this up to the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, which covers Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin. And we got a great panel in there. We got an opinion written by Judge Easterbrook, who's a very famous now judge on that Court of Appeals, and we won. So as of that, Indiana had to allow our people to solemnize marriages in Indiana. Our next stage was with Galen here, was to try and move that decision into Illinois as well, because Illinois is covered by that same decision. It doesn't automatically apply across.
And I'm going to actually ask Galen to step in here, introduce themselves, and tell us how it went over trying to get the law changed initially in Illinois.
My name is Galen, and I've been a secular celebrant since I think right at the beginning of 2015, which is kind of when this whole process started. I did the training with Reba in 2014 and that October, and that was really, really fresh off that Indiana decision. So I think I sent Nick an email the same, like right when I got back from Indianapolis. I was just like, yes, I want to do this, and if this requires me to be in on a lawsuit, yep, I'm all for it. I'm in. We spent a lot of time though trying to avoid that, thinking we could go straight for a lawsuit, but that's not going to win us any goodwill in the state. And I'm a lifelong Illinoisan, so I wanted to do something that would actually at least try the path of let's get this done through a legislative means, and we can always use a little bit of the threat of lawsuit, but going at that by saying, hey, we want to avoid this, can you help us? And also using as leverage the fact that Illinois has been for a few years because of a split government, Republican, Democrat.
And so that went super easy, right? Because you had a decision, they knew it covered them, it was all going to be, right? Everything was that easy.
Yeah, no, not at all. The one thing I do like to tell people, because when this first came out, I saw lots of people are going like, oh, this must be Republicans stopping that. And I'm like, no, our General Assembly is majority Democrat. I think we have the super majority in the Senate and just shy of that in our House. And
yeah, you can take that.
Really,
Now I'm on.
What it comes down to that is that, well, there wasn't much motivation to do anything, even though pretty much everybody agreed that that didn't make any sense to stop. I had Republicans as my legislators at first, and once they heard the word lawsuit, typically were pretty much favorable, as long as they knew that I was a constituent and that I was fighting for that. And we got some movement, but then they just kind of stalled. And that was the thing that I always tell people. What killed us in the legislature in Illinois wasn't people being opposed. It was people not being interested enough to help. So when they pick it up, we got a bill through our state Senate. Actually, it was unanimous. We had several people who didn't vote, I think, because they didn't understand it. But all the votes were yeses for that. But getting it through one house doesn't mean you get the other, and it never got picked up. And that's where we had to just fall back and say, all right, we'll just go ahead and sue. We're not going to wait any longer. I think we were about a year and a half and filed in federal court. So it's not that we didn't give them lots of time, but they just weren't willing to take the extra step. So it is what it is.
Yeah. So Nick, what was the strategy from there?
Well, we, as Galen said, we got to the stage of, I believe, 3 days before the final deadline. We got this through the Senate. We had the mayor of Chicago working with us, thanks to our links with, actually that came through, I believe, the Interfaith Alliance. We had support from everyone on this. Unfortunately, Chicago schools weren't being funded, and the House seemed to think it was more important to try and get a budget to fund the Chicago and Illinois school system than to work with us. So we then went to actually an old law school friend of mine who is a litigator, a good old-fashioned hard-nosed litigator in Chicago with the firm of Schiff Harden. And Mike is a really good friend of mine and a really high-quality lawyer and wanted to do some pro bono work for me. So everything came together, and we worked with the firm of Schiff Harden. And we filed a complaint on it. And genuinely, I thought the moment the complaint was filed, that was going to be enough. That was going to force them to the table. It didn't. I believe the state very much wanted to settle. and walk away from it. But the trouble is, you're not suing the state itself in this, because the state doesn't issue the marriage licenses. It's the county clerk who is the person who does this. So I believe Galen was at the time, and probably still is, in Macon County, very rural, very one of Illinois' poorest counties, I believe. And I actually kind of felt quite guilty at a time that you're naming this county clerk in a lawsuit for something they can't control. So we were suing the county clerk. It ended up, we went back and forth. They would not back down on this. They were trying to claim it wasn't their responsibility, it was the state's responsibility. The state was turning around and saying it's the county's responsibility. We ended up, I believe it was December the 23rd, in Peoria, which travel at that time was a complete nightmare. But I finally got there because the judge made very clear he did not want this to continue. The judge made absolutely clear what way he was going to rule, and it was ruling in our favor, and sat us down 2 days before Christmas and was basically, work this out, work the fee settlement out, work everything out, or I'm not going to let you go home and give your kids Christmas presents. So we ended up with a little back and forth, and the county's insurance company even then gets involved because of paying our fees. We backed down a little bit on our fee demand, because inevitably at that time you back down a little bit on the fee demand. We got a financial settlement, and most importantly, we got the settlement agreeing that the law was unconstitutional and couldn't be enforced. So we got to celebrate, I guess not Christmas, but winter solstice, with Galen being able to solemnize marriages in Illinois.
All right. And I am going to ask Jen then to talk to us a bit about how she has been working on the issue in Michigan. When did you start with this?
So we did a very similar tactic to what Galen and Nick had tried to do in Illinois. Was that in 2015 and 2016, we did a Civics Day, lobbying day at our state capitol in Lansing. And both of those times, we had responses very similar to kind of the story that Galen was saying with, passing the school budget was more important than fixing this little tiny bit of the law. And I have to say our reception has been pretty much across the board exactly what Nick was describing earlier. On both sides of the aisle, religious or non-religious, every single person we've ever talked to has been either saying, yeah, that's not a problem. If we can do that, you should totally be able to do that too. Why is it that way? And then we explain to them what the law says, and they're like, oh, really? Like today, like that still says that today? I'm like, yep, I can read the statute to you if you'd like. And they're like, no. And so I've had no negative reaction, just complete disinterest in actually taking any motion on it, because when we went to the Civics Days, a lot of the Republican representatives, we had even trouble scheduling meetings with them. They wouldn't even answer their voicemails so that we could actually meet with them. And then every Democrat we met with, they were like, yeah, that's not a problem at all. I don't see how anybody would have a problem with this, but you're going to have to get a Republican to sponsor it, and they probably just aren't going to do that. And so we are working with Nick to prepare to getting ready to try and file a lawsuit, because this has been the response now for several years. And we even, in contacting the Attorney General trying to say that this is a problem, they basically said, yeah, no, it's not a problem. And they said, why don't you try doing this legislatively? I'm like, what? We did. Nobody would touch it. So what are we supposed to do now? And yeah, I agree with Nick. He was like, I think they're just not taking us seriously. So so we're going to be doing something very similar to what Illinois said, because unfortunately we are in the 6th district, which is right next to Indiana and Illinois. And so we can use those rulings kind of as to say, hey, they've already ruled this in our favor. Maybe you should just go along with this real quickly so we could save everybody money. But we shall have to see, because the 6th district is a bit more conservative, I've heard. At least the western half of the district is more conservative. So, but yeah, we're in the pre-filing stages at this point.
Nick, how much difference do you expect there to be with this different court?
First, by the way, I actually do want to give a shout out again to Schiff Harden and to Mike Showalter, because it's the same lawyer that we used in Illinois is once again giving up time and resources to do this for free in Michigan. So if you have any administrative law problems to do with environmental regulation, Mike Showalter's your man, everybody. How different is it going to be? Not massively, to be honest. It's, you know, the First Amendment law is First Amendment law across the country. Unfortunately, this just allows a state to be able to say, well, no, you've got nothing on us. The 6th Circuit is more conservative than the 7th Circuit. Neither is as conservative as the 5th Circuit, which covers Texas, which is where we're also trying to do the same thing. It's kind of a patchwork quilt. I don't see it as being a problem because, again, what we're asking for isn't, once people actually look at it, it's not the sort of thing that people on the religious right are willing to go to the wall over. You know, it's not as big an issue for them. And yes, judges, of course, will do everything independently and don't bring their personal, political, or religious biases to the table, of course. But, you know, they do. But on this, it's possible we'll get a district court judge who is totally opposed to it. That happened in Indiana. But I believe once we get up to the level of the circuit court, the Court of Appeals, at that level, this is such an open and shut legal case. I'm not sure there's a circuit in the country, with the exception of the 5th Circuit, which is just cray-cray, that would actually tell us no on this. I hope so anyway.
All right. So we've gone through some of the court cases that have already happened, some that are going forward. Minnesota is in a very similar state to Michigan at the moment, although we have done a lot of that through Minnesota Atheists rather than CFI. But like both Jen and Galen, I started this process by going through the secular celebrant training, which Reba heads up and does most of the training from what I have seen. Reba, we talked about already what happened in Indiana, but can you tell us a little bit about the secular celebrant program? And I'm sorry, I need to figure out how to unmute you now. Because I had muted you while you were getting on. Okay, I apologize.
Does she have the ability to hit the mute thing on her screen?
Yeah, do you have a microphone on your screen, Reba? I'll describe a little bit while she's working on that, the secular celebrant training that I went through. I attended a Women in Secularism conference, and as part of that, we did have the option of signing up for secular celebrant training before the conference started. And so we spent a day really talking about what it is that people look for from people helping them celebrate. We spent a good chunk of that day talking about parts of ceremonies, talking about symbolism, talking about all sorts of various things that people might be looking for in a ceremony, and how to talk to people who are looking for a ceremony about what they were interested in and what was meaningful to them. And I am so sorry, Reba. I am not sure how to get you back. At this point, I think I'm going to push you out of the call and have you come back. It might be a little noisy, but we'll at least be able to hear you. So if you can just rejoin, that would be great. And Galen, you've done a little bit of work on ceremonies too. Do you want to kind of talk about what somebody who might be looking at doing something a little more than signing up for a certificate is kind of looking at?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I've done over the past, I guess I've been technically able to solemnize marriages for about the past a little over a year at this point, about a year and 3 months. And I actually ended up doing, I think, 11 weddings in just that first year. I think mostly because to solemn, here's the thing, people, at that point, people are like, not interested. We'll find somebody else. So once I could do that, I had actually quite a bit of interest, and I've gone actually all over Illinois at this point, as far as Lake County, which is north of Chicago. I'm downstate, about midway through the state, so I've done quite a bit all around the area, from our state capital to Macon County, where I live, as Nick said. The thing that I noticed is that, and the thing I really love about being a secular celebrant, is that you really get lots of different types of people. I've had people who, when I ask them why they want a secular wedding, they're like, "Oh, we're atheists," or sometimes they're like, "Well, atheist, agnostic," or they'll use the kind of terms that fit in there, that under that sort of general secular umbrella. And then some people are just like, "Well, critical for us to go running back to the church at the moment where we need something from them," and so they just want something that's neutral. And even sometimes where I get people who are coming from mixed situations, where maybe one believes and the other doesn't, those are all great times for people to just choose something that's neutral. It gives them something that doesn't have to appeal to any specific kinds of supernatural beliefs or any other kind of ideological things. It's basically just about what's the meaningful part of this ceremony, and how do we help convey that meaning in ways that are going to be applicable not just to the people who are celebrating themselves, like a married couple, but the people who are joining them to celebrate as well. And I think there's a lot of joy in getting to help them work through that process, and getting them to think about what's meaningful, and then getting to help them carry it out and to have that special moment. And that's true whether or not it's weddings or funerals even. Yeah.
And so, Nick, on a slightly more cynical note, that whole training thing seems to also be fairly important, at least to legislatures, if not to the courts.
Absolutely. For me, putting the legal arguments together, it is so important that I can go and say that, we're training people. We're not just handing somebody a certificate after they pay us X dollars online. We're actually going through a process of teaching people what this involves. And so that allows us to turn around and say, we're the ones taking this seriously. We're the ones recognizing the importance of the state role in maintaining records, in doing this. Which brings up, one of the states in which, technically speaking, secular celebrants are allowed is New Jersey. They passed a law on this. If you are a member of any church, any religious group, the religious group decides how they want to ordain you, how they want to say, whether you meet the criteria. If, on the other hand, you want to be a secular celebrant in New Jersey, you have to go through a 6-month training course. So getting the law passed was a success. Unfortunately, I think it still massively discriminates against the non-religious when, again, you can go online and spend 40 seconds signing up and paying $10. And yet to be a secular celebrant in New Jersey, it's a 6-month training course. That's a lawsuit waiting to happen, but there are 50 states out there and they have 50 different laws. So at CFI, we've prioritized on a state-by-state basis where we think, based on where we have trained celebrants and what the law is. So if people have questions on that at any stage, I'm more than happy to answer, you know, why haven't we brought a suit in Wyoming? Why haven't we brought a suit in Florida, for example? But yeah, the fact, as you say, Stephanie, that we train people, we take this seriously. It's these are important legal and personal milestones, and we think it's our responsibility to make sure that the people we certify are actually trained to do this.
One thing that I have had come up in discussions that I've had with people here in Michigan and also people outside of Michigan that know my work through CFI, Michigan has no requirement for what the standing is of any particular person solemnizing a wedding on a religious basis other than that they are affiliated with that religion. I know that some states actually have a certification process through the state where you have to register or be a notary public or something else in addition to being Pastor Smith from the First United Methodist Church. Michigan doesn't have that at all. The only thing that is the requirement is that you make a copy of the marriage license and you send it to the specific person in a certain amount of time. That is the only requirement. And so I don't even know in that sense why we even have to have the thing that you're part of a religion or not. If you're a resident of the state and you are, you know, you sign your name and address and put your phone number and you're there at that address where you say, I don't see why that should matter who does it. I know that there's a history there, and I know like Nick would argue with me on that, but when I've had conversations with people, they're like, oh, well, you have to do certain things. I'm like, yes, sign your name on the dotted line. That's really hard to be able to do, and to fill out an envelope. That's really difficult. So
you're 100%, Jen, you're 100% right. You're completely right, but unfortunately, the way the legal system works is that what's right doesn't always mean what happens.
Oh yeah, no, I know, and I'm just saying, but like, that's one of the things that is helpful to explain to people to kind of get them on our side. The other thing that was also really helpful when I was initially reaching out to see if there would be interfaith support. So if we wanted to have people write letters in support of us as part of lawsuit or legislation, I brought this up at several coalition meetings I was a part of, and every single person in the room was nodding in agreement that we should be able to do this. And especially when I brought up the fact that this was right before the Supreme Court decision on the LGBT marriage equality, was when this passes, we are going to have a whole nother set of people that may have a specific need for an unaffiliated celebrant to solemnize their wedding, because they may even be part of a church and their pastor won't want to do that because of the pastor's beliefs, and so they're going to need to have someone else to do their ceremony. And as soon as I said that, anybody in the room who was kind of looking at me still with this like little bit of like unsure about it, all of a sudden was like, oh yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, and we've used that, and we're going to go on using that because it's a great point, and it's why conservative Christian groups should be on our side on this. Unfortunately, they're not, but they should be, because state after state are passing laws which are 100% unnecessary. They're laws which says that no religious minister can be compelled to perform a marriage for a same-sex couple. Well, guess what? We already have that law. It's called the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. These are asinine show-off laws that allow, you know, the representative from Macon County, for example, to stand up and say, yay, I'm up there protecting the religious. You know what? Those laws aren't necessary, but we'll go in and say, you want to be a CFI certified celebrant, you have to promise us that you will not discriminate based on race, gender, religion, sexual orientation, sexual identity. We don't allow our celebrants the right to refuse to do same-sex marriages, to refuse to do interracial marriages, interfaith marriages. We go to the states and say, if you're worried about the local pastor being forced to marry a same-sex couple, let us do it. We'll happily do it. I'll fly to your state and do the wedding myself if that's what it takes. So yeah, Jen's absolutely right to bring that up. It's a very powerful argument. Unfortunately, not powerful enough to sway the Pat Robertsons of the world, but I don't think anything short of a tire iron is powerful enough to do that.
Well, and since Jen brought up some of the subtleties of various laws, we should also point out that there are groups that are humanist, etc., and the groups themselves generally are secular humanists that are able and willing, and even atheist, under the current laws, to have their people do these ceremonies. They just have to identify as a religion in a lot of states. This is something we ran into in Minnesota. There was an atheist group, had atheist in the name, tried to file one of their people in a county, and the county said no, and they sued. And somebody at the county, I'm pretty sure near the top of the county, perhaps an attorney, said, you guys don't get to decide what a religion is.
Yep.
And so they settled the suit, but that doesn't change the law. So those of us who are still not, those groups that are not willing to identify as religions are still locked out.
And that's the great thing about the Seventh Circuit decision that Easterbrook wrote. He actually wrote in there a couple of beautiful sentences, essentially saying it is not enough that non-religious people can pretend to be religious and do this. And it's fantastic to go there, because I've had people across the country say, yeah, why not? Just go and sign up online and say religious. It's like, that allows that solves the problem for the one wedding. It doesn't solve the overall problem of discrimination in it. And we're right on this. I mean, it's incredibly powerful to go into a legal proceeding knowing just bottom line, you're right. And we're right not only legally, we're right morally on this one.
Well, wasn't that the reason that the appeal was successful, was because the judge in the first ruling actually said, oh, they have this thing that they can do through the ULC, and then the appeals court judge, I loved it, was basically saying, like, are you telling these people to go lie?
Exactly.
Not so many words, but I laughed out loud when I read that. I was like, you've got to be kidding me. Like, and that was an easy appeal.
Yeah, I mean, and the appeal goes into, it deals with all the arguments head on. There's the argument that you can have whatever ceremony you want, and then you can go to the judge and just have him sign it. And it deals with that by saying, that's requiring a second hurdle for people to take, just based solely on the fact they're non-religious. And I keep getting these cases coming up of judges. When you go to a judge to get a marriage, you'll get some judges that can be a little bit of a pain in the neck on this. There are judges out there who will deliberately insert religious references in when they know it's a non-religious person. And what can you do? You're in this is the only person doing marriages. You have no choice. Going to judges isn't a viable or fair option for everybody. So yeah, I love the opinion. If anybody is legally minded, go read the opinion, because Easterbrook, it's rare to see a federal judge take our side as a community so hardcore and understand the issues as well as Judge Easterbrook did. And his brother works for ESPN as well, I believe, or used to work for ESPN.
I think
That's
I
very
remember
relevant.
one of the other things that I thought was interesting that I have recently heard from actually a couple of friends who did decide just to go to the courthouse, was not only would they insert the religious references, but they would only use, the judge would only use their one script that they would do it. And then another one was they were there with 15 other couples. Like it was a group thing. Like they had no, you had no ability to have it be anything like what you wanted. It was their thing. Everybody even did it in unison, which I thought was really weird because it sounded like one of those moon weddings.
Yeah, I was going to go. You sure this wasn't the Unification Church?
No, positive. This was
okay.
over Detroit. It was very, yeah. And so it was really interesting to hear that. And I was like, yeah, that does not sound at all like let's celebrate our special day at all. And
right.
so that's a good point to remind people of, that it's not just that you could have someone do it legally. It's that you're on their schedule on the day and time they pick with their script, and that's it.
Absolutely. It's and again, Judge Easterbrook, you know, used words right on that when he was talking about, you know, people having the right to the wedding that they want, in the way, and it's a powerful argument, you know, because it doesn't hurt anyone. No one loses from this.
I was going to add that I actually have a case that's pretty similar to that, where I have a couple who contacted me to be able to do a wedding, and they were going to have to take care of it legally in advance because it was an international couple and they were dealing with a K1 fiance visa. And midway through the conversation, they were like, well, what would you do to just go ahead and come early, do the legal side, do it privately, and then we have the formal ceremony later when everybody can come. And once I said, yeah, I'd probably be willing to do that, immediately the idea of having a judge do it in whatever county they decided to do it in, out of their minds. That was not what they wanted at all. They just wanted to go ahead and have me do the rest of it. But really, when it comes down to that, they do want something in a lot of cases that's not sort of rigid and formal, you know, going into a courthouse. It's something that feels more personal, that reflects what they want to get out of it. And they should have the right to do that.
All right. So we have talked a little bit about training as a strategy toward getting at least legislatures on your side. I know in talking to you previously about this, Nick, the whole idea of going to the legislature is pretty important, right? We should not be planning to just jump into a showy lawsuit about any of this.
Yeah, federal courts are really, really busy places. Judges are really, really busy people. Nothing annoys a federal judge. Well, I won't say nothing, because I probably annoy a federal judge more than this, but nothing annoys a federal judge more than turning up and saying, here's my problem, solve it for me. What they really, really want to see is that you've undertaken the effort to try and sort the problem out yourself. How can we sort this problem out without this? It's the legislature, and this has been successful. Oregon has passed a secular celebrant law. The District of Columbia has passed a secular celebrant law. I'm blanking on, I believe there's another state that has passed. Even without the threat of a lawsuit there, I think it's very likely, like a state, if Oregon does it, you know, Washington's going to do it at some stage. They like to see that you have at least tried on it. So down in Indiana, Reba put together like a lobbying campaign and had a big, you know, file of letters. We did the same in Illinois, as Galen mentioned. We even got to the stage, as he said, of having a bill go through the Senate. Maryland, I believe, has gone through at least one of the two of the houses. So what's the first step on this? If your state doesn't allow it, is to write to your state representative and state senator and say, I'll work with you on the letter. I'll draft the letter for you if you want, and all you'll have to do is sign it. But it's saying, this isn't allowed. Why isn't this allowed? Here's what you can do. And changing these laws is so easy. It almost invariably involves adding like 3 words to an existing law. It's just adding into the list of people, sort of A through F or A through G or whatever it is, put a new one in there which says certified secular celebrants. And then the slightly legalistic bit is we then have to go in and write them a definition of what certified secular celebrants are. And I'm not sure if Galen was CC'd on this part when we were going back and forth in Illinois trying to get a working definition of who should be allowed. And they at one stage wanted to take it broad enough that any 501c3, any nonprofit could designate people to do weddings. And I'm like, well, I've got no objection to that if that's what you want. You do realize that means the NRA can do weddings. That, then they're like, yeah, we think we've got more of a chance of getting that bill through. I think that's an interesting approach. But yeah, your state may turn around and say, we want to take all restrictions off this. That's their choice. We would then work with them on that. But first step before we file a suit is I need to be able to go to them and say, we've tried. We've tried to follow the democratic process. And to be honest, in the majority of states, the response from your state legislature is going to be tough. We don't have time to do it. But you have to make that first step.
Galen, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
I just wanted to add that I think the creative strategies here is a really interesting approach to that. When Ohio had their last secular summit and the secular celebrant bill has been in their legislature as it was up, I really found that interesting because the way they got around it being making it seem like this was a niche kind of atheist, secular humanist issue is by saying we want to just open this up and say we want to add a category where people can register with the Secretary of State and then they can do it. And so it didn't have to be about specifically for non-religious people, but it covered non-religious people and left that as a very inclusive option. It was very easy for us to talk to people and say, hey, when you go to lobby your representatives, just say, this is just to allow more people in. Doesn't change anything for anybody else. It's harder for them to be resistant on it. And because it doesn't seem to be like a thing where they say, well, this won't win me votes in my district because I have, negligible number of atheists who are going to care about this issue. You can say it's just a way for us to make this a little bit broader. And I think that was actually someone in Ohio's legislature who suggested that. And I really think that those kind of creative solutions, it's certainly that I don't know if but it was a very cool thing to see that there's another way for us to try and go about those solutions.
And I will just add by way of contrast that in Minnesota we had almost the opposite reception. Although instead of the NRA, the go-to 501c3 here was the Sierra Club. You don't really want us to let just like anybody from the Sierra Club do it. And so we actually had to work on a definition based on the organizations that could certify people to do this.
And legally speaking, I think there's still a winning legal argument that to have anyone do it. The argument the state has is stronger against allowing just anyone to do it because they can then turn around and say, well, this is an important record keeping function of the state. If we allow just anyone to do it, it'll be disaster and everybody will be walking around not married because their wedding certificates have got lost in the mail or something. It's still a bogus argument, let's be honest, but it gives them just a little bit more to hang their opposition on. There's other things. I believe it's the state of Florida allows notaries public to perform weddings. That kind of worries us because the discrimination is still there because you're putting an extra step in for people. But I'm not comfortable about going up in court saying well, this person, Galen, can become a notary public, but he shouldn't have to. I can make that argument, but I'm not sure I'm going to win in court. So, yeah, there's a whole range of ways that states address this. Virginia allows anyone to do it, but they have to get permission of a court and file a $500 bond if they're not a minister of the gospel. California makes you go through a specific training session and pay $200. It makes it a different lawsuit to bring, but we're going to get California on this one of these days, whether it's through lawsuit or by the legislature. And I think, come on, it's California. They're not going to vote this down.
Right. Well, and I think, isn't it too, Nick, we've talked about this, why we specifically don't suggest the notaries public or other types of registering with the states, because if you do that, then to make it equal, then every pastor should have to do the exact same thing. But most legislatures or states, they don't want to have to add that extra thing on top of all of these other things, because they're like, oh, well, it's their denomination that controls it or whatever, which is the weird loophole that the ULC gets to go through. But
and it is, there are huge legal problems when the state is turning around and telling a religious denomination what it has to do to recognize someone. If Ohio, and I hope Ohio passes that law, I think that law would be wonderful. I'm not going to oppose it. It's not our job to go to Ohio and say, let anyone do this. Our legal job is to say, our members, our celebrants are being discriminated against. Fix that. If you choose to fix that in a way that allows anyone to do it, all well and good. And I'm not going to fight you on it. But at the very least, you need to fix it so our trained people in the state of Ohio can do the ceremonies, because that's the law.
All right, we're coming down to time here. So somebody who's thinking about tackling this in their state, Galen and Jen first, are there briefly any parts of your experience that we haven't touched on that you feel like somebody should know?
From my perspective, I think trying to target the way that you go about talking to your representatives is always a great idea. When I was talking to Republicans, I didn't frame this as an issue of fairness. I framed it almost entirely as, I understand that you care about the fiscal state of our state government, and we want to avoid this. We just want to fix this so this is right for everyone. And I leaned on that. When I was talking to Democrats, I kept that in mind because it was still important to them. But I led a lot more with those things. Knowing who you are represented by, what they care about, is a really important part of that process. Again, it's not a guarantee, but it's definitely a starting point. And if they know that this is just you reaching out because you want assistance with something you care about, they're going to at least give you, hopefully, a little bit of time. Like I said, I was surprised at how quickly I had my representatives on the phone calling me. And I did not expect that. I expected to talk to aides or whoever. And I was talking to every single one that I got in contact with. And so don't underestimate the ability to get them on the phone, and then just let them know what you care about.
All right. Jen?
And I agree with that. And also, taking the positive route is a much better way. Where we have been framing this, even in the times that we have done this also, is to allow everyone to have the wedding that they would like. And mentioning that we are secular, because part of what we were doing with the civics days at the same time was educating our representatives that they do have atheists and skeptics and freethinkers as their constituents. So we're saying we want to be represented equally as everybody else, and really taking the positive, like making this open to everybody to have the wedding that they want on their special day, rather than saying you've discriminated against us. Definitely the framing there made a big difference in people's reactions.
All right.
A question I've asked people in those situations, which is great when I'm talking to aides and talking to representatives, is, hey, who did your wedding? And they tell you, and they're excited to tell you, and it's like, yeah, it was the minister I grew up with. It was my fiance's father is actually a Baptist preacher, and then just at the end of it, it's like, that sounds wonderful. I mean, sounds like a great service. We don't get that choice.
Oh, good point.
Mm-hmm.
And Nick, I'm going to turn the end of this over to you.
Yes.
As somebody is looking at doing this in their state, where should they start? How can they reach out to you? All that kind of stuff.
Email, always the best, nlittle@centerforinquiry.net. Realize that it varies from state to state, and there may be states that we have to initially turn around and say, that's just not high on the priority list because of, for example, Florida, as I mentioned, notaries public. For example, Virginia. I live in Virginia. It frustrates the bejesus out of me that we can't really bring a lawsuit yet in Virginia. So reach out to me. I'll be back in touch. I will talk to you on it, depending what the state is, what the situation is. The one thing for us to get involved in a lawsuit, we're going to need you to be certified and trained by CFI, and we're also going to need you to no longer do weddings under the quasi-religious cop-out clause, as I call it. I'm a Universal Church of Life, whatever it is, person. We're going to require those two things because it just makes the case an awful lot stronger for us. But hopefully we can get together and change this law in some more states. Excellent. Well, I hope everybody watching has been inspired. You are watching part of OrbitCon. If you want to see more, go to the-orbit.net. If you're not already there, we have an OrbitCon banner ad at the top. Click on that. That'll take you to our schedule, and you can find plenty more to watch. But thank you to all of my panelists here, both for being part of the panel and for making this change, because this is how it happens.
Thanks, Stephanie.